record too. Okay, so we got the recording going. We got enough people here. I'd say I'm going to stop my video. So go ahead, take over and introduce yourself.
Come on. So yeah, so hi all. Yeah, I'm sort of it's sort of just after 6 p.m. UK time. So I might be saying evening. I don't know, it's I think lunchtime for yourselves. Myself, I work as a BI consultant for a data and marketing consultancy called Adroit here in the UK. A lot of our sort of experience that I've had with, and most a fair proportion of our clients are non-profits. So a lot of the sort of demo is based on non-profits, the experience I've had with non-profits organizations. Very passionate about Power BI. I love my mountain biking, and I also love baking as well. And I've put in my LinkedIn on the front page as well if people want to connect up through LinkedIn, which will be great. Intro, why this sort of topic? Well, I've had a number of projects at work over the course of the last 18 months, which has sort of involved trying to do things which so have all sort of led to this sort of process where, and you know, what do I mean by dynamic axes legends? It was trying to find providing users with an easy way to switch the dimension displayed on an axis or legend, and just make it a little bit more easier for people to actually do it. Now, sort of, I know people are sort of say, well, hang on, you know, you've got things like bookmarks, you've got things like drill down and up, and that sort of functionality. But the thing is, if I sort of, if I just sort of go very quickly and just show people the very basic of the sort of data model that I've got to start with. So what I've done is I've created a very basic data model where I've got a fact table with some income data. I've got 4 dimensions coming off of that. I've got a country dimension, a current age band, a recruitment age band, and I've also got recruitment channels, which I'll get onto a bit later on. But the recruitment channel dimension is a hierarchical dimension where you start off where you've got group at the top of it. You've then got channel, then you've got sub-channel. But I'll discuss that a bit more a bit later on. But if I go back to looking at the bookmarks option, which I think people may have come across in the past, I've used it before. So in this situation is where I've got the, as I said, the recruitment channel hierarchy dimension, where I want to give the users the opportunity to be able to quickly flip between group, channel, and sub-channel within you know, a visual. So for example, in this visual, I've got a very basic visual where I've just got total income by the particular level of the hierarchy. So if I'm wanting to switch around, I can just switch across to the channel, or I could switch across to the sub-channel, and all your details within the visual will change. Now, the thing is, it's sort of one of those things with bookmarks. They're actually pretty easy to set up. You don't have to do any sort of fancy Power Query data modeling. There's not much, you know, in terms of that involved. But the only thing is, though, is that what I found in terms of the cons around using bookmarks to try and sort of do this is they can be quite fiddly to sort of update or alter. I mean, if I do sort of any changes to any of these sort of buttons which are driving the switching between the different views that I've got, or you might do some changes, or you might want to move these visuals around on the page or make them small or whatever. The thing is, though, with this particular setup that I've got here, if I just sort of go to the, have a quick look at the views on all the, just trying to get hold of it underneath there. Let me just do this quickly. Can't get to it. But in terms of the views and things, is what I've actually got under here is that I've actually got 3 visuals for the actual the column chart stacked on top of each other. And I've got 6 buttons here. I've got 2 buttons here for the group, 2 for the channel, and 2 for the sub-channel. So I've got 9 visuals on this page at once. So obviously, one of the things that a lot of people know is that the more visuals you have on a page, the greater the impact on performance that you might get. So that is an option, is to use bookmarks. The other option that you could do as well is you could go to a drill down up option. So for example, in this particular chart is I've got an opportunity here where you've got total income by group at this level. I could then drill down and go down to the next level in the hierarchy, where I drop down to the channel level within that visual, or I could drop down to the sub-channel level as well. Now, one of the things, again, sort of very similar to the bookmarks, easy to set up, no additional Power Query data modeling required. But the only, one of the things that I have found at the downside with the drill up and drill down, you can't easily switch legends because you don't have that functionality available to you. The other thing as well is if you're wanting to try and sync visuals on the same page, or even sync those visuals across multiple pages, you can't really do that with the drill down up functionality. And the other thing that I've also encountered with some of our user base is that the icons aren't exactly very obvious on a visual. When you look at it on a page, you can't really see unless you hover over the visual or tell them very explicitly, these are the icons that you need to be using to do any drill down, drill up. And I've also found there's issues as well where people have hit the wrong one, and they've got some various weird results, and they've said, why is this getting displayed? So how did I sort of try and overcome these sort of issues that I was dealing with? So one of the things that I had, so if I sort of just look at the hierarchy dimension that I was talking about, so the first sort of scenario that I wanted to look at is if I had a hierarchy dimension. Now, one of the use cases that I had to deal with is that one of my reports, I had 9 pages of visuals within the report. I had 3 visuals per page, and the hierarchy dimension wasn't actually 3 levels deep, but it was actually 5 levels of that hierarchy. And because of the user base that we're going to be using this report, they were going to be spread across 17 different nonprofit organizations across about 100 different markets. So we potentially have got about 300 to 500 different users spread across the world. And so you've got some people who might want to view the data at the top level of the hierarchy, be your manager, but then you might have a face-to-face specialist who actually wants to drill right down to the 5th level of that hierarchy within the visuals on all those pages. So how did I sort of approach this side of things? So if I look at the first sort of option that I had, which was just looking at it with a visual where you've just got the dimension on the x-axis, is what I'll do is I'll show you what the visuals sort of looked like, how I interacted with them, and I'll go through the process of actually building them as well to help people. So in this particular instance is that I had the slicer on the left-hand side here. So I'm wanting to switch between the different levels of the hierarchy. And then I've got a visual here where I've got those different levels of the hierarchy on the x-axis. So at the moment it'll set for group. If I switch across to the channel, it changes over to the channel. If it's set for sub-channel, it'll switch across to the sub-channel. Now, what it also does as well is that within the visual itself is that I've set it up as well, which I'll get to later, is to conditionally format the columns themselves as well. Because one of the things that we found is that with this particular project is they wanted to have conditional formatting and set colors for each level of the hierarchy. So at the group level, they wanted to have direct mail, DRTV, face-to-face telemarketing in these colors. And then the next level of the hierarchy, they wanted to have different colors for them. And then at the next level, again, they wanted to have different colors. So sort of how did I sort of go about doing this? Now, the other option that I also encountered with these 9 pages of visuals was I also had the similar setup where we also wanted to have this switching functionality within the legend itself. So I might have been wanting to view the income data at country level, but I wanted to be able to switch it not just to the group level, but I wanted to look at it at channel level. I might have wanted to look at it at subchannel level. So you had these two sort of options where you had it at the on the x-axis, but you also had it at the actual legend switching opportunity. So what did I do to sort of get to this sort of stage? So there were a few steps that I had to do to sort of get here. Is first of all is within Power Query is I had the recruitment channel dimension table where what I've got is I've got a recruitment channel key. I've also got a recruitment channel alternative key, which I'll explain to people was used for a sort of later methodologies. There's some sort order IDs that I've used for sorting the group, the group components of the dimension. And then I've also got hex color codes that I've assigned to each of the groups. And then again, I've repeated the same thing for the channels. We've got a sort order for the channel, the description for the channel, hex color code for the different channels, and the same thing for the sub-channels as well. Now, one of the things that you do have to be careful of when you're actually doing this is that if I just sort of go back to the actual, switch back to the actual hierarchy dimension for people to look at, is that in this hierarchy dimension is that at the group channel and sub-channel levels of the dimension, in some instances, you've got direct mail at the group level, the channel level, and the sub-channel level. You've got other instances like face-to-face, where we've actually broken it down to sort of 2 separate sort of door-to-door and private sites at the channel level, but then those might be broken down even further to the sub-channel level. And this becomes really important when you're actually setting it up in Power Query, because especially if your sort order ID, if you're keeping your sort order IDs all the way through, what you need to make sure about is that the sort order IDs are identical at all 3 of those different levels. So for example, DRT, VFR Hyatt Light, this one here, it's got a sort order ID of 2 at the group level. It's also got a sort order ID of 2 at the channel level. And it's also got a sort order ID of 2 at the sub-channel level. And the reason for this is later on is that if you're wanting to sort the actual description of the, so bearing in mind what will eventually happen is that the text descriptor from the group, channel, and sub-channel will all exist in the same column of data. And so if you're wanting to use a sort order ID to be able to sort that column, then you need to have exactly the same sort number for that particular text value. So what I did is within the actual Power Query is I used the recruitment channel dimension as my source. I then took away some of the columns that I didn't want. But what I did though is I needed to make sure that I was able to actually pivot my my recruitment channel dimension. Now, what happens is that if you've got, for example, 3 different columns for group, now what I'm wanting to do is to keep all 3 bits of those information from the group all together when I pivot the data. Now, you're not able to do that if I just leave these 3 columns as they currently are, because I'm going to be pivoting this table on the recruitment channel key. So what I needed to do was to merge the group information into one column of data, merge the channel data into another column for the channel information, and then do the same for the sub-channel side of things. So now what I did is, what you can do is that there actually is an option in Power Query is that if you select all the 3 columns or 2 columns, however many columns you want to combine.
Hang on. So we're still seeing the hierarchy dimension. Are you showing a Power Query?
Yeah, I'll
Is it on a different
quickly
screen?
stop sharing, and thanks for letting me know on that one.
Yeah, somebody put it in the chat and that helped.
Yeah, I think what happens is when you flip between the 2 different ones, you got to keep changing the sharing option. Actually, what I'm going to do is do a quick changeover and just switch to share my whole screen. Then it'll be a bit easier. Stop sharing. And then we'll share the entire screen so I can have both going at the same time. That will be a bit easier. Right, can you see both of those at the same time now?
Yes, yeah, they're
Cool.
side by side.
Yeah, cool.
It's a little bit small on the. It almost looks like you're sharing 2. Oh, because this is your ultra wide monitor thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me. Yeah, I'm just trying to work out how best to share. Quickly share back to. Might be easier if I share on my laptop screen, because then it's one screen that is a bit smaller and might suit everybody. Apologies for this.
It's all right.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, so it'll be a bit easier if I just share it all on the actual laptop screen. And then, yeah, there we go. If I move that across and quickly jump onto. Now the problem is just trying to find the sharing option on Zoom. It's there we go. Right.
Got it.
Yeah, got it there. Right, let's share the screen. Which one is it? There we go. Right, can you see that screen now?
Yeah, we see the snowy background, and then
Okay,
yeah.
can you see Power Query now?
That's much better.
Okay, cool, great. Apologies about that. So live and learn. Right, so on the Power Query route is what you've got is you can highlight. I've highlighted the 3 group columns, and then if you if you do a right click on the drop down here, is you can click on an option called Merge Columns. Now, what that'll do is that'll merge those 3 columns together, and you can then assign a name to. You can then decide what separator you want to use I'm just going to add another one and get rid of it once I've done. So you can decide what separator you want to use to actually join those 3 columns together. And you can also assign a name to that column. What you can do is you can actually assign the same name as one of those 3 if you're wanting to. But you might have to change a bit of the Power Query code, because, so for example, the group, it's very likely if you assign the same name called group, it'll mostly call it group 1 when it actually adds the step to the Power Query. So what I've done is I've got this column called group here, which has combined the group information together. So I've got the sort order ID. Can you see that on your side clear enough?
Yeah, I can.
Cool. Right. So what you've got is you've got the sort order ID of 1 separated by a pipe, and then the text descriptor separated by a pipe, and then you've got your hex color code as well. So for now, go back to the now the problem is trying to get the formula bar back into place and the query settings. There we go. So I did the same thing for the channel information. I did the same thing for the subchannel information. And then what I did is I then unpivoted this data. And so what you end up with is you end up with your channel key, which you're going to be using for mapping it across to as your joining key. I've got a dimension attribute, which is called group, channel, or subchannel. And I've got the attribute values in there for those particular dimension attributes. I've split the information out. So I've now got the sort order into one column, the attribute value into another one, and the hex color code into another column. What I also wanted to do was I also wanted to add in our instances, what I had is that these were the original names that I had. And I actually wanted to add in some slightly longer descriptor names that I could use in the actual dynamic titles that I used in the visuals. So I had channel group, recruitment channel. And so what I did is I just used a conditional column in here to add the information in. And then I split that text, this other one up that I was going to use for my dynamic titles, into the display text and a sort order that I was going to use for the display text, because I wanted to keep it in a particular order. So that's how I sort of got to creating the dynamic recruitment channel. Then if I go back to the actual, to the data modeling side of things, just moving a couple of things around here, is if I go back to here, so what I've got here is I'm looking at the dynamic channel as layout of the dynamic channel. Can you see that slightly smaller model that I've got, a subset of the main data model?
Yes.
So what I've got is I've got the fact income, I've got the dimension recruitment channel joining to the fact income, which is a one-to-many relationship. And then I've also got this dynamic dimension table that I've created in Power Query, which is now linked to the actual recruitment channel dimension. But what you've got is that you've now got a one-to-many relationship going the wrong way around, if you want to call it that. It's going from the recruitment channel back to the dynamic dimension. Now, what you can do is if you're wanting to get your visuals to work correctly, you can change this to bidirectional, and then it'll work within your visuals. But if you sort of listen to a lot of the best practices from the Italians, it's very much a case of rather don't do that, rather use cross filter in your measures. So if somebody comes along and starts adding another dimension table to this dynamic recruit dimension, you don't end up with a headache later on. So the next stage that came, I had to do was to create a couple of measures. So the measure that you end up creating for the dynamic channel is, can you see that at the moment?
Yeah, looks fine to me.
Cool. I hope it looks fine to everybody else. So what you've got here is that I've got a calculate statement, using the calculate function. What I'm wanting to do is I've created a measure called total income, which is just sum of, so if I show you briefly the total income, I've got sum of the income column in the data. And then what I'm doing is here is I'm creating a relationship using the cross filter function between the recruitment channel key from my recruitment channel dimension to the actual recruitment channel key on the dynamic dimension table that I created. And I've set the direction to both. So it'll then be able to do the calculations and the visuals.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Okay. Just because I haven't used cross filter, and just I want to make sure I'm understanding what it's doing.
Yep.
So it's like applying, it's like refining your data model by adding a relationship just for the purposes of this calculate. Is that a right way of thinking about it?
Yeah, it's exactly that. So it's creating that relationship just for that measure itself. So if you created another measure that might not be income, but might be some other additive column within your table, and you added that to a chart, nothing will actually happen because you're actually fixing this relationship at the time for that particular measure.
Great, thank you.
So any other questions from people at the moment? There might be a couple of other ones later on. Anything coming from your side, Kevin?
Nothing in the chat.
Oh, right, great.
We're good.
Right. So what I did then was that within the actual visual itself is, so what you need to do is on the visual itself is the key element, the key thing is on the visual itself is to make sure that the attribute value is taken from the dynamic recruitment channel table that we've created. So the attribute value will have all your different values for your channel, your group, subchannel, etc. And I've put that onto the x-axis. And then I've also dragged in that income dynamic channel measure that I created just now. So I've put that into the values section on the actual visual itself. And then on the actual slicer, I've used the dimension attribute from the dynamic recruitment channel table that we created. And I've set the slicer to single select, so people can only select one option. And again, so we've now got the setup that you cycle through those and it'll change depending on what you actually are wanting to do. The other thing that I also did was as well is in the actual visual itself is to do set up the conditional formatting is that if you go into the data colors under the formatting section for that visual, and you go to the option for the data colors, and there's an option here which you'll have an FX next. It's normally next to it on this side, but because I've set this up already, the FX overrides what the original default colors were. And within the FX option, it'll come up to say, what field value do you want to use? And I then went through to the actual dynamic, to the recruitment channel dynamic table that we created. And I selected that attribute value hex color code that we had pulled through. And it generally just picks it. Either you can select first or last. It doesn't really matter which one you select, whether you do first or last, because it'll be depending on what the value is that you've selected. I've set it to first, and that'll then dynamically format those the columns in the visual when you're switching between the different levels of the hierarchy. Now, in terms of the other one is what I'll do is switch to the dynamic channel legend one. So it was a very similar principle to the axis one. Is we had the visual, but in this case, I didn't have the attribute value in the actual on the axis. I dragged it into the legend field well, and the slicer was set up exactly the same. Now, the only downside to the with having a legend is that you actually can't do conditional formatting at the moment with it, which I would love that to come into play. So what I had to do was I had to load up the PBEX with all the potential values for all the different levels of the hierarchy, and then I had to cycle through each of the different slices, and I could then go to the data colors under the formatting section, and I could then assign the different colors that I had to do. But once I did it once, it then retained that information. And I did it the once for the one visual, and then I copied and pasted that visual across all the different pages and just tweaked what I had to do to that particular visual, and it retained that information for me. So it was a bit of a legwork up front, but once I'd done it, it was all there. The other thing as well that I'd also done is I'd also created some dynamic titles for the visuals. So on the if I go to the sort of dynamic title for this particular visual, if I look at this one, there's one where I was looking at it by country and the channel itself. So what I've got here is that if as I was explaining earlier, is what I wanted to do was in the title itself, instead of saying subchannel, I wanted it to say recruitment subchannel, or in the group option, I wanted it to say channel group, or in channel, I wanted it to say recruitment channel. And so what I did with this one here is that within the actual measure itself, I created another measure for the dynamic title. And what I've got here is that I created a variable within this measure. To the first stage of it was sort of saying, if the actual dimension attribute from the slicer is filtered, then take the next step, which you shouldn't have these issues, is that I just like to sort of put extra bits of sort of code in just to really double make sure that it actually is going to do what I'm wanting it to do. And so if it's filtered, if there's one value from that filter that you've made in that slicer selection, then can you do a lookup to that dynamic recruitment channel dynamic dimension table that we've created for that particular selected dimension attribute? I'm wanting to pull out the dimension attribute display text that I created in Power Query, and then can you display that? If none of these are actually applicable, then it'll just create a blank. It won't even produce anything. And then I've got another measure down at the bottom, which will then take that information above, and it'll then concatenate that together with some fixed text that I wanted in here. And it'll then create my dynamic title. And so I can just cycle between the different slicer selections that I've made, and it'll do what I need it to do. Any questions from anybody before I jump on to the next sort of switching option that I had to sort of look at?
Not in the chat. Very good so far.
Great. No one else. Cool. Right. What's the next sort of challenge I had as well?
Sorry, Anthony, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It was just I'm wondering if while you're on this, is it possible to deselect subchannels so that you can choose and highlight certain subchannels, or is that far too complicated to do? So let's say you have too many subchannels and you wanted to show or give the option to the user to pick some subchannels and not all of them. Is that easier to, is it easy to do based on your experience?
Yeah, you can. Yeah. So if, for example, you wanting to, so basically what you're wanting to do is, do you want to add some other slices or filters to the page for argument's sake?
So let's say you wanted like, let's say you had too many subchannels and you wanted the user to be able to pick like two or three subchannels so they don't have as busy a visual.
Yeah, so I could do exactly this. I could add a slicer onto the page, or I could use a filter pane. But what I'd be doing is using the subchannel group or channel from the actual original dimension table. So for example, if I say filter out face-to-face, DRTV, and direct mail, so I only want to see those three subchannels.
Right.
Is that what you're wanting to do?
Yes, kind of like that, yeah. So you would use the original dimension table to filter.
So what you're wanting to do is you want to make sure you use the original dimension table to be able to deselect various options that you might want to have. And you can do the same thing on the axis or on the legend, whichever one you want to do. And you can also do it as well. If I wanted to, for example, here is that I've got multiple countries here. I might want to filter out certain countries on the visual. So just the same as sort of filtering any other visuals. You can also do highlighting if you're wanting to as well on the visuals, and it'll work just the same.
Brilliant. Thank you for that.
As any other ones.
Thank you.
All right. Cool. Right. So any other questions before I jump on to the next one? Right. Let's crack on with the next one, as I know time is sort of the essence here. So what the next sort of scenario that I had was I had multiple dimensions. So I wanted to be able to have a situation where if I jump to here, I wasn't necessarily just looking at a hierarchy dimension, but I had 3 or more different dimension tables within the actual data model, and I wanted to be able to have it that I could actually switch very easily within visuals, just like I was doing with the hierarchy dimension. So what I've got is I've got the country dimension, I've got a current age band dimension, and I've got the recruitment age band dimension. Now, this is a nice simple scenario to play with. I had a situation where the ones that I was building, I had 18 separate dimensions, again, across multiple pages, across multiple visuals and multiple metrics that people wanted to see. And I think I calculated that if I had to do each individual one separately, I would have ended up with about 200 visuals all in all. So by using this, I managed to cut that down to about 30 visuals, I think it was, as far as I can remember, or something like that. So, right, so in this situation is it works slightly differently to the actual hierarchical dimension. So I'll quickly show you the dynamic legend. So very similar scenario. So in this instance here, I've dragged on the group from the recruitment channel table, and I'm wanting to view it by country in the legend in this instance, or I might switch across to current age band, or I might switch across to recruitment age band. Now, one of the things that I want to try and hopefully people can see is that the recruitment age band options are 0 to 24, 25 to 30, 31 to 40, and 40 plus, and they're identical to the current age band age bands that we used. Now, these were set up as two different separate dimensions within the data model because we wanted to do analysis on them as two separate entities. But it's really important to understand that these two values were identical for slightly later on when I'm actually creating the dynamic dimension table. So what I'll do is I'll jump back across to Power Query, and I'll go across to the, sorry, not to Power Query. This one works slightly different to be able to create the dynamic dimension table that I wanted to do. The way that I approached this one is I ended up using DAX and created a calculated table within DAX. I could have done it in Power Query, but what you would have to do in Power Query is to make sure that every single one of the dimension tables that you're merging together have all got the same column names, just to make your life a little bit easier when you're merging all the tables. And that's really what you're needing to do, is to make sure all the column headers are the same names. So what I did is I decided to go down this route rather, and I didn't really have much difference in terms of performance of the actual report itself. So what you've got here is that I'm using the union function to union the selected columns from the different dimension tables that I'm wanting to join together. But what I've got is, I'm just going to show people very quickly the country table. Now, what I've got is, I've got a country key that's 1 through to 7 that is linking to my fact table. I've also got an alternative key here, which I just created a random number. I used the 40s for the alternative key. Within the current age band, I had exactly the same numbering for the actual age band key that links to the fact table, but I've created a completely different range for my alternative key. And then for the recruitment age band, I've got the same thing, same numbers, same range for the actual key column, but I've got a different range for my alternative key. Now, it might be that people in other situations, they have the actual key that they link to the fact table might be unique to that particular dimension table. And so you don't have to worry about creating another alternative key. The reason for doing this, I'll explain in a few minutes' time. So within this situation here is that what I'm doing here is I'm selecting the columns from different tables. So the first one here is taking the columns from the dim country table. I'm pulling through the country alternative key, and it's going to be called the attribute value a key as my column header. I'm going to pull through the sort order ID as well, and the column header will be called attribute value sort order ID. I'm then going to pull through the country name. I'm also going to pull through the hex color code as well. And then I'm also wanting to, so the dimension attribute here column, I'm wanting to assign everything to be country, because I'll be using country in my slices later on. And very similar, same principle with the current age band table, is I pulled out the alternative key, the sort order from the age band, the current age band text, the hex color, and I gave it a name of current age band within as the dimension attribute, and I repeated that process for the recruitment age band. So what you end up with is a table that looks like this, where you've got an alternative key as your sort of linking key. I've got the sort order IDs here. I've got your attribute values. Now you can see here for the, as I mentioned earlier, is the current age band. You've now got two values of 0 to 24. So you've got one coming from the current age band dimension and one coming from the recruitment age band dimension. And then I've also got the hex color codes as well. Now, the reason this becomes an issue for doing your matching is that if I look at the data model now for this particular situation, now the data model is slightly different to the previous one. So what you've got is, can you see that data model yet? Kevin, can you see that one? Just to confirm.
Yeah.
So what you've got is you've got the fact table on the right-hand side here. You've got your three-dimension tables, your country, recruitment age band, and current age band connected to your fact table. But now you've also got this dynamic dimension table that you've created as your calculated DAX table. And that is linked up via your alternative keys to each of your different dimension tables. But the other key thing that I wanted to show people is that all three of these relationships are all set up as inactive relationships from your dynamic dimension to your original dimension tables. So what will happen there is that I'll actually use the function useRelationship within the measure later on to determine which relationship I want to make active at that particular point in time, depending on the selection that I've actually made. Now, what happens here is that in your dynamic dimension table, if your attribute values, so you don't necessarily have to use integers if you don't want, you might just have text values within your dimensions that you're linking your text values to your fact tables. So you can use your text values from your dimension tables. The only issue is that if you've got text values that are identical across two different dimension tables, then you won't be able to create these relationships. The relationships will start throwing an error, and I've learned this to my detriment, is it'll throw an error and say, I can't actually able to create this relationship because there's no uniqueness on the actual values within the dynamic dimension table, which is the reason why I created these alternative keys for my three-dimension tables, because I knew that the recruitment age band and current age band dimension values would be identical. And also too is that I was using, in terms of the keys that I was using in all three tables, I started 1 through to 7, 1 through to 4, and 1 through to 4. So I knew I was going to get duplicate keys to try and do the matching on it. Now, the next stage that I then was looking at was, so that's your sort of relationships that you've created to those three tables. I then needed to create the actual measures themselves. So the measure that I created was a measure called dynamic dimension. Now, it's slightly different to the dynamic channel one. So what I've got here is that I've actually used a switch function, and I think you talked about switch functions on Tuesday night, in actual fact, or I think it was Tuesday night, as far as I can remember. So what this does is that it'll work through, depending on what you've actually selected. So the selected value from the slicer, if I've selected country, it'll then decide, right, I wanted to actually activate the relationship between the attribute value alternative key and the actual dimension, the country dimension table via the country alternative key. And then it'll calculate your total income. And the simile is for the current age band, is if I've selected current age band in the slicer, it'll then activate the relationship between the alternative key and the dimension, the dynamic dimension table, and the original current age band table, and similarly for the recruitment age band. And then through that, it'll then return the value that I'm wanting. And so depending on so within this visual itself, I've got the attribute value as the legend from the dynamic dimension table. And I'm now using the dynamic dimension income measure that I created as the value. And so when I switch between the different options in the slicer, that'll then activate the relationship that's required for that point in time and calculate the income for these particular, in this particular instance. So country, it'll calculate it for country, calculate it for current age band, or calculate it for recruitment age band. And similarly to what I got asked earlier, is you can also you can add other slices here. So you might have a long list of countries that you might want to filter out certain countries from the visual, or any other dimensions within your data model. It might not necessarily mean it's dimensions that are being used for the switching setup. You might have some other dimension that you're wanting to use. So for example, in this instance, I might want to use one of the recruitment channels as a slicer. And if I filter on that, it'll filter the visual, because all the actual dimensions are all linked up together in the same data model in this particular PBEX. And then again, I also created a dynamic title for here. So what I was wanting to do is, I knew I was using channel group on the x-axis, and then depending on the selected value in the slicer, I pulled that through into the dynamic title and used that measure as within my dynamic title. Any questions on that particular one before I jump on to the next one?
None on the chat. Anybody want to come off mute and ask a question? All
Great.
right.
Cool. So the third sort of scenario that I ended up with was we had to create we originally had a data auditing tool that we used that was based in Excel. Now, the problem was with this Excel file, it was limited to 1 million rows of data. And when you're having to distribute this Excel file to multiple organizations, markets, that file, you had to create a separate Excel file for each of these 100 market organization combinations. So the challenge I had was, can I bring this data auditing process into a Power BI report? So what ended up happening was that I had this situation where I wanted to have the functionality where I was able to switch the x-axis, and I also wanted to be able to switch the legend as well. So people could select whatever they wanted, whatever combination they wanted to be able to audit the data. So what it ended up doing was using a combination of the previous methodology that I've just showed you, as well as Bookmarks as well, because that was the only way that I could actually set this up. And I'll sort of run through a sort of another way of setting up, having a slicer for both the legend and the x-axis, but I ran into storage issues on my import mode. So what I had in this situation is that I had the visual was set up just as I've done previously, where I've got the dynamic legend in there. But what I also did is I set up then 4 buttons on the left-hand side for it. And what I did is I then populated the axis with the channel group, the country, the current age band, and the recruitment age band. And I used, what I ended up doing was just cycling through the different hierarchy levels. So for example, in this situation is if I select the group, I've got channel group on the axis and the country on the legend. And then I set up the bookmark for that particular scenario. if I then cycled through to the next level, I then set up a bookmark for the country button, same thing for the current age band, and I also did the same thing for the recruitment age band. So I had different bookmarks that would be able to cycle through each of those. But within that flexibility is that I still then had, people still had the flexibility to be able to change the legend, whatever I had within the x-axis. So for example, you might have recruitment age band on the x-axis, but I might have wanted to be able to view it by current age band if I wanted to. Or I might have wanted to switch back to the country on the x-axis and switch across to the recruitment age band. So I was able to switch between any combination that the users wanted to be able to switch between. And then we set up this, I set up the same thing for other metrics as well that people might want to have viewed. And it actually worked extremely well for what people wanted to achieve and what we wanted to achieve in the first instance. Any other queries on that one before I sort of run through the sort of final option?
None on the chat.
Great.
Doing great.
So this is another option that I experimented with before I had to revert to the bookmarks and dynamic legend variant, was to actually have an option where you could have a dynamic legend and a dynamic axis. And so you just had two slices on the page. You didn't have to worry about bookmarks and the fiddly nature of those. And so I could just cycle between each of these. I could also bring in options from the actual recruitment channel hierarchy dimension as well. So I might wanted to have done whatever combination I wanted through this route. So I could have done group on the legend, and then I might have done recruitment age band on the x-axis, or I could have done country on the x-axis, etc. Now, one of the challenges that you've got with this is that what you need to do is, if I jump over to Power Query, is first of all, what you need to do to be able to get this to actually operate is you need to add an index column to your fact table. So I just added the index column in Power Query. You might want to do it upstream in SQL or wherever your data is getting sourced from. And so each row within my fact table has got a unique ID for that particular row. So each combination of dimensions that I've got here have got a particular index ID. And you really need that for this to be able to actually work. So what I ended up doing is following very similar principles to the previous dynamic tables that I set up. In my instance, my fact table, I'm using numeric keys. So what I ended up having to do was, obviously having a 1 or a 2 or 3 in a slicer doesn't really make any sense to people. So I wanted to bring in all the the text descriptors from the different dimension tables, which is kind of, you're sort of thinking, well, I may as well just put the text descriptors in the fact table. So what I had to do was merge the different dimensions into a version. So I used the actual fact table as my data source. I then merged in the country data and expanded that out. And so I ended up with the different attributes that I wanted to pull through. So I wanted to pull through the sort order and the country text value for this particular situation. And then I merged the country attributes, as I demonstrated earlier on, into one column. And I repeated the same process for the different dimensions that I had. But what I also did is I also included the recruitment channel. So I was also bringing in dimension, so various columns from the actual recruitment channel hierarchy dimension, and I pulled that into this particular, into these dynamic axes and dynamic legend. And then all the way through, I ended up then with a situation where I had a dynamic access table, which had the index ID, which was coming from from the fact table, and all the different dimensions that we're going to be using that connected to that fact table, the sort order ID that came from the dimension tables, and the text descriptors as well. So I brought all those in, and I also wanted to add in a sort order ID for the different dimension attributes as well. So I could actually sort these dimension attributes in the slicer for a particular order that I wanted to do. So it wasn't going to go country, then current age group, then, channel, then country, current age, band, etc. I wanted it to appear in a certain order within the slicer. I did the same principle for the dynamic legend as well. And I then pulled those through to the data model. And so what you end up with is you end up with a fact table that you have your fact table, and you have your two dynamic axes linked to your fact table, matched on the index ID that we created in the fact table. Now, again, we've got the situation where the relationship, the direction of the relationship is, the filter direction is one to many from the fact table to the dynamic, to the two dynamic dimensions. So what I ended up having to do was to use cross filter again, but use cross filter twice within the actual measure itself. So if I go to the dynamic measure that I created here, so what you've got is that instead of just having one cross filter set up, you can actually add in a second cross filter that was then actually doing the relationship between the fact table and your dynamic legend, which was this one on the bottom, and the other one was doing a cross filter both direction between your fact table and your actual dynamic axis. And that then will be able to go down depending on which slicer combination you're actually selecting at that point in time. Now, one of the things that I would say is to be very, very cautious of with this particular approach is that, as you can see, you might not see it now, but within the fact income table, in this instance, I've only just got 500 rows of data. When you switch across to the dynamic axis table, you end up with 3,000 rows of data because your data is getting pivoted for each combination of index and dimension attribute that you've got. So in the instance that I had at work, I had a fact table that was 7 million rows of data. I had 18 dimensions in that particular fact table, and it ended up generating a dynamic dimension table that was 126 million rows of data. And so if I try to replicate that for a legend, as well as try and replicate that for two other tables the same size, I would have exceeded my import mode restriction very, very quickly on it. So it'll work. So it's one of the things to bear in mind that it works very well for tables that are, say 100,000 rows, and you might have only say 5 to 10 dimensions, but just be very cautious of that your dynamic axis and legend very, very quickly multiplies to a huge number of rows. So in this instance I got myself to a place where I can actually have this and I can switch around on the visual. Now in this instance, I've only got 3 visuals on the page instead of having, I actually can't even work it out at the moment, is where I'd end up having to create 2, 4, 6. I'd end up having to create, if I wanted to have every single combination of all of these different visuals, I think I'd end up with about 36 different visuals. Whereas in this instance, I've got 3 visuals on the page and a lot easier to manage. So that's it. Thanks very much.
I think that's very interesting. I think it's good to see there's some creative data modeling and usage of DAX to get to this point. Like you said, kind of thing that drove it home for me at the end there was this, that you would have to put 36 different visuals on there. And where you started, if you worked with bookmarks and all this other type of stuff, it would be quite the pain to produce and maintain. Very interesting. Very creative approach. Anybody else have any questions that they want to come up and meet with?
I've got one more, Anthony, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It seems like sometimes you use relationships, sometimes you use a cross filter. I guess it's based on the relationships you're making, but is there sort of a preferred sort of approach? Because I'm not quite sure when you use which. I know in terms of the documentation when you should use cross filter versus use relationship, but in your case, I'm not quite sure why you're using one versus the other in some of the examples.
Yeah, so if I just go back to the sort of the different data model layouts, that's sort of a bit easier to sort of explain that. So if we're looking at the sort of the dynamic channel layout, is that when I've got the, if you can zoom, if I zoom in, zoom in a bit on here, is so what's happened in this instance here is that I've got from the dimension recruitment channel through to the dynamic version, I've got a one-to-many relationship for that. So I'm going to need to use cross filter to reverse the filter direction, so it'll go back the other way for it. Whereas when I was doing it with the dimensions, is that I actually had a one-to-many relationship coming from the dynamic dimension through to the actual through to one of the dimension tables. And so use relationship is that what I'm doing is that use relationship is actually different to cross filters. At use relationship, I'm actually saying I'm wanting to use this particular relationship and make it active, whereas a cross filter is used to actually change the direction of your relationships that or the filter direction between your two tables. So that's the difference between them. Your cross filter is changing your filter direction between your tables, whereas in the dynamic dimension, I had the filter direction was correct, but I wanted to actually activate the relationship to get it to actually work at that point in time.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So,
I think also, and I don't know if you tested it, right, but normally relationships will perform better than the cross filter in DAX. But like you said, when you have to model it the way that you do, sometimes you have to apply or reverse that direction within your DAX code. And so then it's acceptable. And then of course you test it with your model to make sure it performs or whatever. But I'm kind of like you. I like to start with when I have relationships to use them, and then code it into the DAX later if I have to.
Yeah, that was my preferred. When I originally built this, the first iteration actually was using a virtual dynamic table that was extremely slow. And then I then sort of thought, hang on, why don't I actually create physical relationships? And I managed to get it to work with using a physical relationships.
Makes sense. Great question. Anybody else have any other questions? All right, I know a couple people already had to drop. They put it in the chat, trying to get back to their day job. I appreciate people that stayed longer. I found this very interesting. Again, I found it very creative. I've done a few things. I don't think to this level, where I've done creative sorting and stuff like that. But this was definitely a good approach. And somebody wrote in the chat that they'll be coming back and looking at it again. So we definitely appreciate you presenting. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now, and then that will be available probably sometime this weekend.